We welcome you to our program today. We're studying Job chapter 27. So if you would turn in your Bibles to the passage and let's begin. Job 37, we see the conclusion of Elihu's discourse. Elihu continues his speech. There is no break from the previous speech. He continues to magnify God's work and his greatness, which he began back in Job 36 and verse 24. In verses 1 to 13, Elihu speaks of God's work. Verse 1, "At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place." Elihu continues to speak concerning the rising storm of Job 36:33. Perhaps there was an actual storm coming, which they could see approaching. At the sight and sound, Elihu's heart trembles. He is afraid. Job 11:19, we see the same word translated there as afraid. So his heart trembles. He is afraid. His heart leaps from its place. And so we see his courage departs. Verse 2, "Hear attentively the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth." Elihu says to listen to the thunder, to listen to the rumbling. God is speaking through the thunder and the rumbling of the storm. Concerning Revelation, it might be helpful to note that, again, perhaps concerning Elihu, along with those who are listening to them, heard an approaching storm. It is true that man can see the hand of God in creation. Here we see what some refer to as general revelation. Romans 1 and 20, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." So they could see the power of God, for example, in the thunderstorm. That'd be an example of general revelation. You could see the hand of God from creation. We see God's handiwork. However, one may learn the will of God for man only through the revelation of his word, and that may be described as special revelation. Now, what exactly did Elihu have in mind? Well, all we know is what we see here in the passage. And so he says, "Hear attentively the thunder of his voice," God's voice, "and the rumbling that comes from his mouth," God's mouth. And so in one sense, yes, God does speak to us in the creation. We see the handiwork of the Creator, that God created the world. Now, if Elihu is speaking of some special revelation, as though God were revealing his will for man through the thunder or through the rumbling, then that would be something else. Verse 3, "He sends it forth under the whole heaven, his lightning to the ends of the earth." Elihu says that God sends the thunder and the rumbling under the whole heaven. He sends his lightning to the ends of the earth. According to Elihu, God's voice may be heard everywhere. Again, we see the work of the Creator in nature. We look around at the creation and we see the handiwork of the Creator. Verse 4, "After it a voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain them when his voice is heard." Elihu says that after the lightning, there's the roaring of the thunder. He describes the thunder as God's majestic voice. He says that God does not restrain them. Some versions give the antecedent of the pronoun them as the lightnings. So when God speaks, Elihu says with the thunder, God does not restrain or hold back the lightnings. when his majestic voice is heard. Verse 5. God thunders marvelously with his voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. That's certainly true. There are many things that God does, many things about God that we simply as man cannot comprehend. They're beyond our ability to understand. It's like the clay pot trying to understand the potter. Here in verse 5, after commenting on the thunderstorm, Elihu concludes that God does great things which we cannot comprehend. And so he does. He does great things beyond our understanding. Verse 6. For he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength. He continues to speak of God's work in nature. God, by his commands or through his natural laws, tells the snow, the gentle rain, and the heavy rain to fall on the earth. Here we see the providence of God. In verse 7, he seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. Elihu says that God seals the hand of every man. He's saying that God stops the work of every man so that all men may know his work. So you might have the picture of men working, but here comes the snow, or here comes the rain. And because of the snow or the rain, perhaps the thunderstorm, the thunder and the lightning, the man may be forced to stop his work. Here he says God seals the hand. It's as though he closes the hand of every man. The hand is used for working. So it says God seals the hand of every man. So God stops the work of every man. Why? According to the passage, so that all men may know God's work. Perhaps this gives man time to reflect on God. Verse 8. The beasts go into dens and remain in their lairs. The falling of the snow or the heavy rain can stop men from working. Likewise, the beasts of the earth may need to take shelter in their dens or remain in their lairs for safety, for shelter. So what was true of people was also true of the animals. One cannot control the weather. Men cannot control it. Men can forecast, perhaps, the weather, but what can they do about it? Likewise, the animals take shelter. Find some place that is safe. But here we see comment concerning man in verse 7, but also the beast in verse 8. Verse 9, from the chamber of the south comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds of the north. And so he says that there is the whirlwind and there is the cold. Whirlwind's the term for a storm, a destructive storm. And so while the whirlwind may often come from the south, the cold often comes from the north winds. So from the chamber comes the whirlwind and the cold from the scattering winds. Verse 10. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Elihu says that by the breath of God, ice is given, or ice is formed. He also says that the broad waters are frozen. One might picture a lake freezing over. he describes how the waters freeze solid. The psalmist spoke of the word of God, the word of the Lord, as the breath of his mouth in Psalm 33:6. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. Perhaps that's what he had in mind here, Elihu, by the breath of God or by the word of the Lord. Ice is given. And so, whether through God's command or through God's laws of nature, we see that ice forms and waters freeze. Verse 11. Also with moisture, he saturates the thick clouds. He scatters his bright clouds. God saturates the thick clouds with moisture. You look up in the sky, you see the dark, thick clouds, and you think, here comes the rain. Perhaps with those thunderstorms he mentioned earlier, the thunder and the lightning, perhaps he did see at that time, maybe that setting, there were thunderstorms approaching and there were clouds, thick, dark clouds in the sky. Here he says how that God saturates those thick clouds with moisture. Other versions read, he loads the clouds. One might picture those, again, those thick, dark clouds. The second part of the passage, he said he scatters his bright clouds. And this is literally the clouds of his light. This might refer to the scattering of the clouds after the rain. Of course, with the sun and the rain gone and the clouds scatter, the sun shines through. Verse 12. And they swirl about, being turned by his guidance, that they may do whatever he commands them on the face of the whole earth. Elihu says that the clouds swirl about in the sky. He says that the clouds, whether they be the thick clouds or the bright clouds, he mentioned earlier, the clouds are turned by God's guidance. And we see the providence of God in nature. He said they do whatever God commands them to do over the face of the whole earth. Verse 13. He causes it to come, whether for correction, or for his land, or for mercy. God causes the cloud and the rain by it to come. It may come for the punishment of the wicked. It may come for the good of the land, to provide moisture for the crops. Or it may come for the benefit of man. He says for correction. Elsewhere in the book of Job, the word for correction is literally translated as a rod or the rod. For example, Job said of God, let him take his rod away from me. Job 9:34. By Job's observations, he had also said how the rod of God was not upon the wicked in Job 21:9. And so he says here, Elihu says that the cloud may come for correction, may come for his land, God's land. The cloud may come for the production of food for the land, for man and beast. And third, we see cloud may come for mercy. Perhaps the cloud comes because of God's mercy. Perhaps there was a drought, or is a drought, and so God showed mercy or loving kindness. The term is also translated as kindness in Job 6:14 and favor in Job 10:12. So here in the first 13 verses, again, Elihu continues from the previous chapter in chapter 36, describing God's works. God is the maker, he's the creator, and we also see his hand and the works of nature. So here he describes the greatness of God's works. In verses 14 to 18, Elihu makes an appeal to Job to consider God's works. Verse 14, listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Elihu addresses Job by name. He calls for Job's attention and appeals to him to consider the wondrous works of God. One looks at nature and one can look at these things with wonder and awe. He then asked Job a series of questions for his consideration. Verse 15, do you know when God dispatches them and causes the light of his cloud to shine? First, he asked Job, do you know how God dispatches the clouds? This term may describe how God places or sets the clouds in the sky. One version reads, establishes. So, do you know how God establishes the clouds in the sky? It may also mean that how God lays his command upon the clouds, and so how he controls those clouds in the sky. Do you know how God causes the light of his cloud to shine? Earlier, Elihu spoke of how God scatters his bright clouds in verse 11. Of course, the answer to the question is assumed to be no. Do you know when God dispatches the clouds? No. Causes the light of them to shine? No. Verse 16. Perhaps we today might better understand these things of nature than they did so long ago. But we see so much still the wondrous works of God in creation. Verse 16, do you know how the clouds are balanced? Those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge. Second, Elihu asks, do you know how the clouds are balanced? He asked if Job understands how the clouds, those wondrous works of God, are balanced, how they float in the sky. One version reads hang poised. So how are those clouds balanced or poised in the sky? Do you know, Job? He says that God, as demonstrated by his wondrous works, is perfect in knowledge. And while Job may not know, God certainly knows. We note that earlier Elihu claimed to speak the truth in Job 36:4. He also said that his words were not false, and he said, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Job was being referred to there as you. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you, Job. Now, again, we noted before how much that sounds to be arrogant in the way that he said those words. Was he saying that God is there with you? Or is he saying that he himself has the knowledge that he received from God? Was he being boastful or arrogant? Anyway, we talked about that some in the previous lesson in Job 36:4. But here he uses the same words. Speaking of God, he says, God who is perfect in knowledge. And so this may refer to him being complete or entire. While there are things that we lack, we do not understand, God knows. Verse 17, why are your garments hot when he quiets the earth by the south wind? Third, Elihu asked Job, why are your garments hot? It may be that the temperature, the weather is very warm or hot, and so the clothes that they wore were hot. And while they knew that the weather was hot, as they sweltered in their clothing, they did not understand how perhaps the south wind brought the hot weather to them. Verse 18, with him have you spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror. Fourth, Elihu asked Job, did you join God to spread out the skies? We've talked about how God is the maker. He's the creator. Well, were you there with him to help him spread out the skies? God made everything by himself. Isaiah 44:24, I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself. So he asked Job, are you with him? Did you help him spread out the skies as a craftsman might hammer out a piece of metal? The term spread out here in the passage may be used to refer to somebody who beats out or who flattens something. It's like a man who beat metal to make it thin. Elihu in the second line describes the skies as being strong as a cast metal mirror. He uses the analogy of a cast metal mirror where one would pour molten metal into a mold. In the time of Moses, we read about bronze mirrors, mirrors of burnished or polished, highly polished metal to form a reflective surface. Exodus 38:8. So the answer implied to those questions, no, you do not know, Job. Now, in verses 19 to 24, we see the conclusion of Elihu's speeches. His presentation will soon be over. Verse 19, teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. It appears here that Elihu is mocking Job. Teach us what we should say to him, Job. Say to who? Say to God. He asks that Job teach him and teach the other people who are listening what they should say to God. They could not prepare anything to say because of the darkness of their understanding. After all, Job was so bold to bring his wish, to present his wish to bring his case before God. Certainly he knows. Surely Job could tell them how they could prepare. So it seems like he's in some sense mocking Job here. Teach us what we should say to God, Job, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness, because we don't understand. But apparently you do. Verse 20. Should he be told that I wish to speak? If a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up. Elihu looks at this as foolhardy. Elihu asked Job if God should be told that he wished to speak. I think about going before a king and how that it was required that they have permission to go before the king. Otherwise, certain death. But here Elihu asked Job if God should be told that he wished to speak to him. He then says that if a man were to speak to God, according to Elihu, he would be swallowed up. He would be destroyed. So if he was to argue with God, present his case, as Job wanted to do, he would be destroyed. Verse 21, even now men cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. Elihu says that men cannot look directly at the light, the sun in the sky, as bright as it is in the skies, after the wind has cleared away the clouds. His point is that Job could not come before God in his brightness to speak. He says that Job would not survive. He'd be swallowed up. He'd be destroyed. Verse 22, he comes from the north as golden splendor. With God is awesome majesty. Here the point is made that God is awesome. Elihu describes the awesome majesty of the glory of God. He had just spoken of the light, or the sun, when it is bright in the skies, verse 21. And now he says that God comes from the north as the golden splendor. The word splendor is provided, and this is not a particularly easy passage, but the basic point of it is understandable, that God is brilliant in his glory. We see the awesome majesty, the wondrous works, the glory of God. And he is more lustrous and shining than any gold could ever be. Verse 23. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power, in judgment, and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Elihu praises the Almighty as being beyond the ability of man to fathom. Well, he's correct. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He says that he is excellent in power, in judgment, and abundant justice. He does not oppress or afflict unjustly. God will judge, and the judgment will be fair. Verse 24. Therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart. Men who are wise of heart fear the Almighty. The wise have reverence for God. They fear God. They revere him. Fearing God may mean to be afraid, but it also may mean to revere, to reverence. And so he says that therefore men fear him, looking at the glory of God and his marvelous, wondrous works. Men fear him, and rightly so. He is the creator. He's worthy of our fear. He's certainly worthy of our worship. The wise, he said, have reverence for God. However, men who think themselves wise are not regarded by God, who shows no partiality. That brings us to the end of the chapter and to the end of the presentation of Elihu. Before we go on, and we'll look at, Lord willing, the next chapter at our next opportunity to study. But before we do, there are some questions for consideration. Just some things to think about. We noted here that this is the end of Elihu's presentation. And so let's look at some of these points before we move on to when Job is spoken to by God in Job 38 to 41. While Job answered the three friends, Job did not respond to Elihu. Why is that? Well, think about it. Did Job agree with Elihu? Did Job think that his discourse was unworthy of a response? Maybe he simply had nothing more to say after speaking with the three friends. Remember in Job 31:40, after he was done, it says, the words of Job are ended. Maybe Job did not wish to speak with Elihu, whose wrath was aroused against Job. Back in Job 32:2, talks about his wrath against Job. One might not wish to speak to somebody if they were angry with them in that way. Then again, perhaps Job did not have the opportunity to respond as God answers in the next chapter. So those are just some possibilities, some possible answers to the question, why did he not mention him? Well, Job answered the three friends. Why did Job not respond to Elihu? Something to think about. We also note that Elihu is not mentioned again by name in the rest of the book. God, we will read, did not mention Elihu in rebuke, as he did Eliphaz and the three friends in Job 42:7. Now, does this mean that Elihu was correct? Not necessarily. Then again, did God rebuke Elihu? Did he do so without naming him by name? Again, there's a few things to think about. Well, anyway, perhaps we'll address some of those more as we finish the rest of the book. But next time, we'll be looking at God and what he had to say to Job. Look forward to it. Thank you for being here today. And as always, there's more to learn. There's always more to learn, but we hope that what we've talked about today has been helpful in better understanding this chapter of the book of Job. Thank you again.